Okay, welcome back to Introductory Sociology. This is going to be a makeup lecture for the material on social stratification. The reason I'm doing it by myself is because when I recorded it earlier, there was a glitch and things didn't work out well. So I'm going to redo this now. All right, and of course there won't be any students in the classroom. So we're going to talk about social stratification today, and that's the existence of layers, or strata, within a population that possess unequal shares of the scarce desirables, namely wealth, power, and prestige. Now these strata we call social classes, and we're going to talk about various perspectives on this topic, namely the symbolic interaction perspective, the conflict perspective, and the functionalist perspective. Now, to begin with, there are two key questions that we have to ask. How much stratification is too much? Because we could have a system where, say, 90% of the population live in absolute poverty and 10% are really rich and there's not much in between, and it's very hard to either move up or move down. We wouldn't want to have that kind of a system. Now, of course, on the other hand, it's really impossible to have a system where everybody is equal. Even in a communist government, there are people who have more money or less money. Second, can people realistically move up or down? For example, if somebody is in a wealthy family but is lazy and unmotivated, we would want to have a system where he isn't rewarded for his laziness and would move down the social ladder. And on the other hand, if somebody was in a poor or middle-class family and worked hard and got an education, he or she should be able to move up the social ladder. And so those two things are important to start out with. Now, each of these layers is a social class. It's a segment of the population whose members hold a relatively similar share of the scarce desirables and have similar lifestyles, norms, and values. Now, we can't put a monetary value on this. Of course, we have middle class, upper class, lower class, and so on. We couldn't just say that if you have a family income of, say, $45,000 that you're middle class, because it depends where you live. If you lived in New York City, that isn't that much money. On the other hand, if you lived in a rural area like Friona, Texas, that would be more, you'd have more ability to purchase a home and to supply the needs of your family. So we're going to talk about these classes, and we'll talk about the three major perspectives, as I said, functionalism, symbolic interaction, and the conflict perspective. Now, I just want to make sure this is good, it's recording. Don't want to have to redo this again. So let's go ahead and continue. We'll begin by talking about the three main dimensions of stratification: the economic dimension, namely money or income, the power dimension, and the prestige dimension. First, for Marx, the economic factor was the real cause of stratification. He argued that those who owned the capital used their position to maintain themselves and their family. And also the proletariat, the working class, was sort of stuck in that position. When I talk about money, and Marx's point is having money enables you to move up the social ladder and to stay in your social position. For example, something simple like how much does it cost to buy a reliable car? If you're poor or lower class, you don't have the money, probably, to purchase a reliable vehicle, and in the long term, you end up paying more for repairs. Similarly, buying a home. It's cheaper to own a home and pay the mortgage than it is to pay rent, but many poor people are not able to purchase a home. They can't afford it. They can't afford the down payment. So Marx argued that society is economically conditioned, and those who control the economy determine the nature of the society. He said that both wealth and income are controlled by the powerful, and for the exam you'll need to know the distinction between these two. First, wealth refers to all of one's economic resources or assets. So if you had to sell everything you had, and include, or to divest yourself of your money and so on, your car, your home, and you paid off all your debt, what are you worth? That's wealth. Income refers to the amount of money that a person or family earns per year from a job. Now, even in the U.S., income inequality is widespread, certainly comparing us to Scandinavian countries. In 1998, about 35% of the U.S. population were living in poverty, and of course we'll talk about this later on, but we're using the term here, absolute poverty, a figure determined by the federal government. Now, some of the consequences of this are inferior health care. So, for example, if you're poor, you're likely to have Medicaid, or in New Mexico, Blue Salud or Blue Centennial. And this health insurance doesn't pay as much as Blue Cross, Blue Shield, or other private insurers. And so doctors are less likely to accept patients with Medicaid. And also, if there's a test or procedure or medication, it may not be covered under the Medicaid, but it would be covered under a private insurance. So they don't get the quality health care. And many poor people, working poor, don't have health insurance. And so they end up paying 2 or 3 times what the insurer would pay. So, for instance, there's typically an agreed upon value or price for various procedures that insurance companies have with hospitals and doctors. But if you don't have health insurance, they're very likely to charge you more than that agreed upon price, and it can easily be twice. So poor people suffer from poor health care, poor diet, obviously, because it costs more to purchase healthy food. If all you want is the most calories for your buck, then things like pasta and potatoes and things of that nature will be cheaper for you. Low quality housing, simply because it costs more to live in a better house. And those who are poor may often end up living in dilapidated housing, trailers, etc. And then poor public services, because if you live in a poor area, there's unlikely to be a nice supermarket or nice library. The schools may not be as safe or desirable. And some of this is due just to economic factors. A nice supermarket is more likely to locate in a suburban neighborhood than the inner city. If you look at the inner city, a large inner city, there may be pawn shops, liquor stores, gun stores, bail bondsmen, but there's less likely to be good, legitimate businesses that are available. Now, the power dimension, economic success increases the chances that a person can be powerful politically, for example. Most all politicians in the U.S. Senate, for example, are millionaires, and to be able to win a political campaign, you either have to have money or be able to get it through donations. And so, and then just the level of respect given. When people are perceived as being wealthy or well-to-do, they're often respected more. So, for example, one time in Moses Lake, Washington, I was going to deposit a government check from my retirement annuity plan, and I was dressed in kind of dirty clothes because I had been gardening and doing landscaping, and they put a hold on the check. But in a similar case, when I was dressed normally, they accepted the check and the funds were immediately available. So you can see how the perception of wealth influences how people treat you. On the other hand, there are other sources of power, like charisma and expertise. Hitler was charismatic and obtained power in that way. And then there are people who can become powerful by attracting public support. Again, Hitler, he generates support from the masses. But generally, having money enables a person to be more powerful. Now, prestige refers to the recognition, respect that we give to people based on their position as defined in a society. Generally, those who are more well-to-do, have better jobs, are likely to be given more prestige and more respect. They enjoy similar lifestyles. They may engage in conspicuous consumption in order to send a message to others that they've been successful. This is consuming goods or services that are not absolutely necessary. So driving a Hummer as a soccer mom, for example, or wearing a George Armani suit, having the newest iPhone, all of these things send a message that a person is successful. And so that's the term conspicuous consumption. And by the way, for purposes of the exam, if I ask you to define a term, you can always find the definition in the glossary of your book in the back. Now, the most stable source of prestige in our society is occupation. Most people, for example, agree that doctors who are specialists, like surgeons, have more prestige than accountants or bus drivers. And occupational prestige is based on the following factors, and for the exam, you may need to know one of these. Compensation. Generally, if the position is paid more money, it is given more prestige. Now, of course, there are some exceptions, like a drug dealer might make a lot of money, but it's illegal and not a prestigious thing to do. But generally, if you make more money, it's a higher prestige position. The amount of education required, so for example, if you're going to be a doctor with a specialty, you need 4 years of university, and then you need 4 years of medical school, and 3 or 4 more years of training in your specialty area. So you probably won't start to work or practice independently until you're 29 or 30. Now, the skills and ability required, for example, how easy would it be to replace a person who does the job they do? So if you work at Burger King, it might take a week or two to train somebody to do what you do. On the other hand, if you're a nurse, a surgeon, a computer programmer, it's not easy to quickly replace you with somebody off the street. And so when there's more ability and skills required, the position is more prestigious. Now, the power associated with the occupation, more powerful, like a judge, a lawyer, for example, will have more prestige. And the current importance of the occupation to society, and this will change. So, for example, right now there's a high demand for windmill maintenance technicians, and that position is paid more and is more prestigious because of the demand for it currently. And then overall, the nature of the work, which sort of sums up all of these 5 factors above. Now, it's true because all societies have to accomplish certain basic tasks. So occupations that require more skill and training will pay more. As I said, it's more difficult to replace people. And so they're viewed more highly. Now, functionalists would say that some amount of stratification is useful because it motivates people to work hard, and if you eliminated that stratification, there'd be less motivation, or maybe even no motivation. Ronald Reagan told a story on his radio show a number of years ago about a little red hen that was walking around in the barnyard and got the idea of picking up grain and wheat and making bread. And so she asked for help from the other barnyard animals, but they all said that she was exploiting labor and she was a greedy capitalist. And so she did it herself, and then she got to the point where she was going to crush the grain and asked help and got the similar responses. Ultimately, she baked the bread, and then all the barnyard animals demanded that they divide the bread equally among the ones who hadn't worked. And so they forced her. It was all split up, and she was, of course, upset about this. Then a week later, the barnyard animals said, "We need more bread. Aren't you going to make any more?" And she said, "No, I'm not, because you'll just take it away from me and divide it among the other animals in the barnyard." And so Reagan's point with this is that in a communist system, for example, in the former Soviet Union, if you tell a farmer that he can only make this amount of money and demand that he have a quota of grain production, he's only going to work to the point where he meets that quota. He has no incentive for being more productive. So inequality then renders a service. If we paid nurses the same as we paid ditch diggers, there'd be less incentive. There'd be a shortage of nurses, just like you can see in countries like India, where their medical personnel often are recruited to come to the United States, where they make more money. So functionalists would say some amount of stratification is functional, useful, and desirable. Now, if it were extreme, if it were a system where pretty much 90% of the population are poor and have no hope of moving up, that kind of a system wouldn't be considered useful or helpful. There's a philosopher, Thomas Rawls, in his Theory of Justice, that's the book he wrote, he said, imagine a situation where you're going to create a society and its stratification structure, and your worst enemy will pick your position in that society. What kind of a society would you create? And he goes on to say that you wouldn't probably want to have a communist society where everybody is equally poor and lacking materials, but you'd want to have a society that had some inequality, but not too extreme, and it's possible for people to move up. That way, if your worst enemy makes you a homeless person, you can work up the ladder by hard work and effort. Now, some problems with this explanation is some people, like rock musicians, Justin Bieber, etc., professional athletes, are arguably paid more than they contribute to society. And second, there have been historically barriers to some groups in terms of competition, racism, etc., or sexism. And the functionalist theory overlooks the inheritance of social class. Even in societies with a strict caste system, without a strict caste system, children of blue-collar workers find it hard to get up the social ladder. In fact, 2/3 don't. They stay the same as their parents. And some of this is just due to social expectations. When you're raised in a poor family, it's sort of understood or that you will end up in the same boat as your parents. On the other hand, if your parents are college educated, early on you aspire to do the same thing. Now, and of course the theory assumes that everybody wants to compete. Some highly educated, qualified people like nuns don't really care about becoming wealthy. Now, the conflict perspective, they would argue that stratification exists to perpetuate the status quo. The rich create a system that legitimizes their inequality. And so it's assumed that everybody's poor because they're lazy, and if you're rich, it's because you work hard. But it's arguably case-by-case basis. In other words, there are, in fact, some poor people that pretty much the only reason they're poor is because they're lazy and they don't want to work and get educated. On the other hand, there are alternative explanations. For example, maybe the unemployment rate is high, or maybe a factory is shut down, or maybe a mother, her husband left her and isn't paying child support, or maybe there's a physical disability, etc. So there can be alternative explanations, and Marxists would say, though, that the system tries to keep the poor poor. Policies, for example, like denying people government loans or Pell Grants or student aid if they have a drug conviction, when we find in the research that poor people are more likely to be arrested and convicted of drug convictions, even though recreational drug use is just as high among the middle class young teenagers. So Marxists would be critical and would argue for a change in the system. The symbolic interaction perspective helps us understand the legitimization of social stratification. Growing up, we're taught that our place in the system is based on our talent and effort. And, well, that's true to an extent. There are alternative arguments. But those at the bottom often suffer from low self-esteem. They come to think of themselves as undeserving. So a person's self-concept can help preserve the status quo. If you think you're poor because you're just not talented or intelligent enough, you may accept that belief, and then it becomes a reality. This is what is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, stratification in American society, Americans have always been aware that there is inequality, but have never really developed a class consciousness. If you ask Americans in surveys what their social class is, most all of them will say they're middle class, because they look around their neighborhood, their community, people who are near them, and say, I'm pretty much like the people I know. And so there's really little sense of a class consciousness. But with that said, we'll talk about the social classes that exist in the United States. First is the upper class. It's about 1% of the population. Most of them inherited their money in whole or in part. So, for example, the Bush family. He was able to purchase the Texas Rangers, go to I believe, Yale University, and a lot of that was due to his family having wealth. So this is a small percent, and they're multimillionaires. Now, some of this 1%, the upper class, are the new rich, like the founders of Google, often in technology areas. They may have the same amount of money, but they're generally barred from the exclusive social circles that the true upper class belong in. Now, the upper middle class, they've been successful in politics, business, and the military, and they earn enough to live pretty well and save some money. I hate to attach a monetary figure to this, because it depends where you live, but we're typically talking six-figure income, $100,000 a year or more. They're typically college educated and have high educational aspirations for their children. So for the kids, it's not a question of whether they'll go to college or university. It's more a question of where and what they might major in. And typically this group does not have any sort of significant debt. If any, it will be good debt. And as I've pointed out before, the two main types of good debt are student loans, if you have to get them, because they're an investment in the future, and then a mortgage on your home, because that will increase, your home presumably will increase in value. Now, the middle class is a fairly large group, about 30% of the population. Of course, Karl Marx, in his time, didn't really imagine or believe that there would be a large middle class. But there are small business owners, small farmers, independent professionals like optometrists, doctors, and lawyers. They participate in politics quite a bit. And as a matter of fact, if you look at voting turnout, the richer people are, the more likely they are to vote. People less likely to vote are those who are poor. And of course, this is perhaps a problem, because if you look at the last 30 years of national and state elections, there have been many that have been very close. But unfortunately, only about half of eligible American voters will turn out and vote. Now, the lower class, this group is pretty, it'd be difficult to discuss or identify. For example, when I was doing research with the project on policing neighborhoods in St. Petersburg, Florida, we were riding with police and recording narrative and numerical data about their interactions with citizens. Anyway, one of the things we had to do was to code the likely social class of the citizen. And one way we did it was by noticeable dental decay. Because like me and most of you who are listening to this, you've probably at one time or another had a cavity. Now, if you couldn't afford to get it fixed, it's likely that ultimately you would lose the tooth. And so you'll find people in the lower class often have noticeable dental decay. They tend to be employed sporadically. They don't always, oftentimes they're unemployed, and many of their family members have a long history of unemployment. And they lack value in the labor market. In other words, they don't have the skills, ability, and talent that are in high demand. So, for example, they may be stocking the shelves at Costco or Walmart in the middle of the night, and the reason why they continue to do that and are not paid a lot is because they don't have in-demand marketable skills that people would pay them for. So, poverty in America can be defined as a lack of adequate housing, food, medical care, and other necessities to maintain life. Absolute poverty. Hello? Just a minute. Can I call you back? I'm doing a lecture right now. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Anyway, I'll try to edit that out later. Relative poverty, on the other hand, is measured by comparing the economic conditions of those at the bottom of the society. So in this sense, even if you looked at, say, a rich Kuwaiti oil sheiks, the one that would be relatively poor compared to the others. And that's more of a criminological concept that we'll talk about later on. But absolute poverty uses a poverty line developed by the federal government. And what this does is every year the government conducts a survey of the cost of living state by state, and also the cost of food and things that are necessary to survive. And then they publish a figure that is based on family size for what is the amount of money that you would need to be able to support yourselves, to just get by. So the poverty line. Now, this chart is perhaps out of place, but one thing I just wanted to point out by this chart is that it's often assumed that poverty is just an inner city thing. But if you look at the data, the darker places here are rural areas. Overwhelmingly, poverty is higher in rural areas, like rural Appalachia, or over there in Washington State, the Colville Indian Reservation. Of course, if you look at New Mexico, the Santa Fe area is the only place that has very high incomes. Now, the poverty line then measures the amount of income that is sufficient to pay for the basic necessities of life, food, shelter, and clothing. And it will be different depending on the time. It's updated every year. And of course, one criticism is it's a state-by-state figure, when we know that in some places in the state, the cost of living is higher. A figure I found a number of years ago from Washington State would say that a family of, I believe, four, 2 adults, 2 children. If they're making less than $14,000 roughly per year, then they're below the poverty line. So you can see that this is a really tight budget. If you throw in things that are real lowball estimates, cost of rent and heating and electricity and so forth, you can see very easily they're going to be over that budget. And so, and it of course assumes that people are frugal and careful shoppers, when many poor people make poor, impulsive decisions about what they purchase. Or they may, for example, purchase cigarettes that aren't necessary, or go eat out, go to movies, etc. So the family in this case is not meeting their budget, so they have to cut something. Should they eat less food or sell the car? As you can see, there are hard choices that a family would have to make. And what happens if the family doesn't have health insurance? In many jobs, if they don't work 40 hours a week, they don't get full benefits. And even if they do have health insurance, it's easy to pay a lot out of pocket. For example, my family, not to say we're injury prone or anything, but it's not uncommon for us to pay out of pocket $4,000 or $5,000 a year in medical expenses, even though we have health insurance. So one should note the poor, as I said, spend money on other things that like entertainment, movies, and so forth. So considering this situation, it makes it difficult. And those who are on public assistance or welfare and receive, it's not food stamps anymore, it's an EBT card, they get a budget monthly, whereas most of the rest of us are paid every 2 weeks. And so it's not uncommon for poor people to run out of money and run out of food before the end of the month. Now, so the absolute approach to poverty holds that a certain amount of goods and services is essential to a family's welfare. The problem is there's not universal agreement about what constitutes minimum needs. So is a car or truck a minimal need? Depends where you live. If you lived in New York City with a good train system, you could probably get by without a car. On the other hand, if you lived in a rural area, it would be harder. And another problem, though, is that the poor are poor not only in the absolute sense, but in relation to others. And so poverty is relative to time and place. So the relative approach, though, says that a person who is poor if they make substantially less than the people in their immediate vicinity. And so in this case, there will always be poverty because we're never going to have a society where everybody makes exactly the same amount of money. And we wouldn't want that kind of a society, as the functionalists point out. So who are Americans poor? They tend to be minorities, females, and children, the elderly and the disabled. The reason for females, one reason anyway, is that oftentimes they end up divorced or separated, and their ex-husband is not paying for child support. And there are ways to enforce this, but even so, it's hard. In Scandinavian countries, the way it works is the government sends the check to the mother for child support and then bills the dad. And so if the dad's going to be a deadbeat, he's got a problem with government, not his ex-wife. But in the U.S., we pay directly to the ex-wife. So 2009 was one of the worst years in poverty in half a century. We had the housing market collapse and the banks had to be bailed out. This was due to speculative loans. Banks were giving loans to people that really couldn't afford to make the payments. And once they defaulted on the loan, they'd take the house and sell it at a profit. But when the real estate market tanked, the banks were left with a lot of bad loans. So the number of Americans living in poverty then hit 43.6 million, the highest in 51 years. Now, how do Americans view the poor? Well, many Americans think that they're lazy because if we think if they just worked harder, they'd succeed, and that those who work hard will be rewarded. So economic failure is an individual's own fault. So there's a lot of negativity there. And Americans have bad attitudes about race and poverty. There's this image of the welfare queen having children to get more welfare. But after Bill Clinton's welfare reform initiative in 1994, I believe, that was no longer possible. The only exception would be if your children qualify for supplemental security income, SSI, namely they're considered to have some sort of a disability like ADHD. In that case, then you would make more money by having more children, assuming they all were disabled. Now, combating poverty, welfare reform has moved many people off welfare, but they mostly have not gotten good jobs. The idea behind welfare reform is putting a time limit on welfare, like 10 years that you can get it, and during that time you are either required to receive job training through a college or technical school or even a university to acquire marketable skills, or to work in a job where they train you and you acquire marketable skills through the work. The problem is, and then the employer get tax breaks for doing that. So if you hire a welfare recipient, you're going to get a big tax break. The problem, though, is that a lot of people on welfare, where they're working is in fast food and retail, where it's really not the type of job that will give you marketable skills so that after 10 years you'll be successful. I mean, it's a lot like this. Imagine you couldn't swim. And so somebody gave you a couple years of really crappy, bad swimming lessons, and then at the end had you walk on a diving board and pushed you off the diving board into the pool, and so you either sink or swim. Well, that's potentially a problem. And so there's criticisms of welfare reform. The best thing, in my opinion, is to make sure that whether it's on-the-job training or technical school, etc., that you really are getting skills that are going to be in demand and will enable you to be self-supportive. So, for example, go for 2 years to be trained to be a windmill technician or radiology. I mean, those. If you get those skills, then you will be able to support yourself and your family. Now, Consequences of poverty. Poverty reduces your life chances and the chances of your children. For example, you may not be able to support your children in terms of their education. The cost may be prohibitive. People in higher classes tend to marry later and experience lower divorce rates, and they tend to be better at effectively disciplining their children. And so you see what we call the inheritance of social class. It tends that we end up in situations like our parents. Now, as for our life chances, we may talk about social mobility. That's moving up or down the social stratification structure. Vertical mobility is important to understand. How is it, or why is it, that some people move up or down the social ladder? We don't have a caste system like historically in India. There's no rule or law that says poor people can't become wealthy or middle class. And so if you work hard, it's likely that you will improve or succeed. Upward mobility, though, is small. Only about a third move up the social ladder compared to their parents. And it's influenced by occupation. So why does this mobility occur? Well, one reason is less qualified immigrants or rural workers may take the lower paying jobs and sort of push those who are doing those into some other field. And because the higher class have fewer children, members of the lower class are going to be needed to fill high status jobs. In other words, if, say, you had 10,000 jobs available for computer programmers and only 7,000 of prospective applicants are from upper class families, you're going to have to look elsewhere to promote and encourage entry into those STEM fields. Technology may create higher paying jobs. I mean, we have so many jobs related to computers and internet and the connection of computers. And so that has created jobs. Now, we'll wrap up just briefly by pointing out that we're certainly not as bad in terms of inequality as third world countries, where the situation is dire. But we don't do as good a job as, say, the Scandinavian countries as helping people and giving them the skills and education they need to move up the social ladder, and also to having a social safety net and other things. You can do some research about that. So point is, the U.S., we have our criticisms in terms of the inequality, but we're certainly not as bad as, say, Honduras or El Salvador. We'll go ahead and wrap up there. Normally I'd ask for questions, but this is a recording that's been done in private, so I'll stop her there. Thank you.